And we're being recorded. This will be a great conversation to start thinking about addressing the legacies of sexual violence and racial violence in tandem. So as we approach arts and justice, I'm excited for that. For this conversation, if you're not speaking, please go ahead and mute yourself. Although we are glad to see videos on for folks who want to join us in the audience, to get a sense of who we are in the audience.
Marcy, it says.
There we go. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator for tonight's panel, Timothy Jones. Tim is a second-year doctoral student in the Department of Theater and Performance Studies, and is also pursuing a certificate in critical consciousness and anti-oppressive praxis at Stanford University. He is a producer, scholar, artist, and multidisciplinary artist with intersecting research interests in race, sexuality, aesthetics of risk, and socio-political choreographies. He is primarily interested in the Black male body and undervalued performance and technological citizenship-making practices. Recently, Tim completed a project that looked at sex work and digital performance in the age of COVID-19. He is also curating a podcast in collaboration with members of the Onyx Leathermen organization, which will examine the intergenerational experiences of Black men in kink. Prior to Stanford, Tim earned an MFA in theater management and production from Columbia University, as well as a BA in English and BA in drama from Morehouse College. Outside of his professional and artistic endeavors, Tim is involved in homeless, foster care, and carceral advocacy work. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Jones.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kari, for that introduction. I am so excited to be here amongst our inspiring panel of artists and scholars. And it's so interesting to be here in this space and time at this particular time in history to be thinking about the intersection and interplay of kink and consent and race. The world of kink has gained tremendous commercial traction. Therefore, the state of kink seems to be in a transition from sort of isolated sites of hidden pleasure to mainstream sites of commodification that elicit general public consumptions. The shadows of kink are sort of carving out new spaces in the daylight in movies and even on Broadway. This heightened public entry combined with the history of racialized kink activity in regards to race play and cuckolding provides a sophisticated opportunity to advance the discourses surrounding shame, consent, pleasure, ethics, and what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. Now, with the emergence and interplay of the Me Too movement, the hiring of intimacy directors, and the burgeoning solutions and tensions within sexual and racial justice, we are at a very interesting, sophisticated time in history where race, sex, and culture collide. The Old South lives on the McGregor plantation, in the breeze, in the cotton fields, and in the crack of the whip. Nothing is as it seems, and yet everything is as it seems. Slave play rips apart history to shed new light on the nexus of race, gender, and sexuality in the 21st century of America. Slave Play is a 3-act play by Jeremy O. Harris. The play is about race and sex and power and relationships and trauma, but more specifically about the interracial relationships and the dynamics and intricacies that happen within those. It follows 3 interracial couples of different sexual proclivities and orientations that undergo what people consider, or what is labeled in the play as, antebellum sexual performance therapy, because the Black partners no longer feel a sexual attraction to their white partners. This play has shaken the American theatrical landscape and has provided an opportunity for us to have really, really interesting and risky dialogue and courageous dialogue about race, kink, and consent. I am so excited to announce our first presenter for the evening, Amber Jamilla Musser, who is a professor of American Studies at George Washington University. She has published widely on race and critical theory, queer femininities and race and sexuality, and queer color of critique. She is the author of Sensational Flesh, Race, Power, and Masochism, and Sexual Excess, Queer Femininity and Brown Jouissance. She also writes art criticism for the Brooklyn Rail. Currently, she is working on a project on noise, shadow, and coloniality. please join me in welcoming Amber Jamilla Musser.
Thank you so much for that, Tim. I'm excited to be here among this group, although I will preface my remarks by saying that I am not actually going to be speaking directly about slave play, but I will later on have a lot to say about it. So my remarks are tentatively titled Pleasure and the Fantasy of Consent. So when I first started thinking about masochism, I was most enthralled with its transformative properties, its seeming defiance of the pleasure principle and the alchemy behind shifting pain into pleasure. Masochism metabolizes, I thought, by which I meant it is best understood as the process of making pleasure where most would find none. What I uncovered with more research, however, was more complex. First, I realized that pleasure, despite being imagined as something that brings one outside of the body, is something firmly rooted within one's context. Second, that context relies on all sorts of implicit social contracts. So what does this mean? The first masochists, as described by Richard von Krafft-Ebing in Psychopathia Sexualis, and he was the first person to use the word masochism, were wealthy men who described fantasies of being beaten, trod upon, and whipped by women. They wrote elaborate descriptions of these scenes of submission, focusing on how good it would feel to relinquish control. The women offering punishments wore gloves, furs, boots, corsets, their interiorities excavated in order to exteriorize these men's fantasies, their pleasures unmentioned, and all of this consecrated with the contract, which further cemented the difference between normal social roles and the performance of their reversal. And so what was socially transgressive actually reified established social norms. So I write about this situation extensively in Sensational Flesh in order to put pressure on assumptions about the work that masochism performs in its position as an imagined exterior to modern sexuality. I argue that this performative outsideness actually reinforces sexuality's tethering to liberal subjectivity and agency, enabling some to take advantage of transformation while keeping these possibilities out of reach for others. Those primary others being those who are racialized as non-white. In Sensational Flesh, I focus most extensively on the limitations of masochism as described by Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon argued that the United States' desire to punish Black people manifesting in virulent anti-Black violence were swiftly followed, quote, by a guilt complex because of the sanction against such behavior by the democratic culture of the country in question, end quote. Fanon exposed the hypocrisy inherent in holding anti-racist ideals while allowing racist violence to flourish. The country's national masochism, he argued, meant that the United States could not recognize its own forms of white aggression. Instead, the country embraced a stance of passivity and victimization in relation to non-whites, disavowing their own overt violence. And this should sound very familiar to cycles that we are still in. So what we see in this short description is the different ways that pleasure and contract intertwine for Fanon. The pathology of masochism was founded on a broken or impossible social contract and produced pleasure for those who violated it. Importantly, it was vastly different from the waves of shame that accompanied the feeling of becoming Black, which he describes as a form of shattering. This cleavage is important, I think, because in addition to allowing us to see the impossibility of a universal form of subversion or pleasure, it allows us to understand the estrangement between becoming a person of color and consent. This form of racialization comes from without. It is enacted through external forces that project onto bodies. Reckoning with the violence of this process and its relationship to settler colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, Hortense Spiller uses the term pornotrope, which I argue functions as a theory of racialization and expressivity. For Spiller's, pornotroping is a process of objectification that violently reduces people into commodities while simultaneously rendering them sexually available. Through its discourse of fleshiness, pornotroping emphasizes the ways that power and projection produce certain bodies as other, thereby granting them a mysterious quality of desirability, which is always already undergirded by violence and the assumption of possession. This process of othering is part and parcel of racialization, and it reveals a break in the idea of the contract, since it produces the other as alienated from liberal subjectivity and agency. Moreover, in relation to consent, those who have been rendered flesh, those who have not chosen to submit, but who have been made to submit, have historically been denied the ability to consent. Initially, this was because they were considered property. However, entry into the category of personhood has not necessarily expanded access to consent, because the concept is not only shaped by one's ability to affirm or deny, but also by the legibility of this communication to a broader audience. Not only any other immediate parties, but also witnesses, so jurors, for example. For these reasons, Emily Owens draws a line of continuity between the impossibility of consent under conditions of enslavement and the difficulty Black women find seeking justice in cases of sexual violence, arguing that this negation of sexual agency continues to mark the experience of Black women. She writes, the history of consent's ability to protect only certain women is directly tied to those whose consent historically mattered, whose consent was imagined as legible, who could be considered a victim of gender-based violence, and that history certainly informs which women consent will or won't protect in the present. So Owens further suggests that Black women will never really be able to consent given their history of sexual exploitation. In addition to this, tied up in the problem of consent is the question of desire. If one cannot be said to consent, is desiring actually possible? And so that's a much bigger question, but this conjunction returns us to masochism and the question of pleasure. So Krafft-Ebing had a difficult time grappling with the possibility of female masochists because their agency was suspect. And now people have a difficult time wanting to understand Black people's, especially Black women's, desire for submission. On the one hand, these desires are illegible because agency itself is so precarious. And so how does one give up when one actually does not possess? On the other hand, the politics of respectability shame those whose individual desires might impede progress towards gaining more agency for all. We see these tensions most overtly in debates about Kara Walker's work, which I've written about extensively in other places. Saidiya Hartman brings these questions to her reading of Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, noting, quote, Jacobs requires that we do not consider only the restricted scope of Black humanity, but also the effort to act as a desiring subject in a context in which consent inadequately designates the enactment of possibility in the constraints of agency. This leads Hartman to argue that the nexus of desire, consent, and coercion that situates discussions of the slave girl sexuality perhaps entails a consideration that attends to the agency of the dominated in terms other than those that we have previously considered. For if not a conspiracy of power, seduction in this instance enables opportunities for disruption and offers a glimpse of the possibility in the context of peril. So what Hartman points to is a reading of actions and wants that may be constrained but are still thoughtful, something that Hartman describes as deliberate calculation. And so in this space of this what else, what actions are possible when the social contract has been broken are important. In my own thinking through the pornotrope as racializing scheme, I argue that the flesh reveals both possibility and violence and the oscillation between these poles. And this is what I talk about as brown jouissance, which I describe in Sensual Excess. Brown jouissance, I think, is importantly uncolonized by subjectivity and its related formulation of desire, which is inextricable from theorizations of sexuality. This shift, I think, it reworks pleasure, allowing its abundance to be unleashed by unmooring it from a relationship to consent or desire, but transforming it into something to be attained in many different ways. And so by way of brief example, I'm not playing it for you because I think everyone's imaginations will just go there, which is great. I turned to Jacoby Satterwhite's video, Healing in My House, which mobilizes BDSM, Blackness, and queerness. So in Satterwhite's video, multiple figures were and so I should say Satterwhite is, this is a digital project, but he's also makes sculptures and other forms of other artworks, but yeah. So in Satterwhite's video, multiple figures wear leather, including gyrating figures of men and Satterwhite himself, who dances and vogues in a leather harness and biker shorts. In addition to this, the creatures in the video and actors often use whips and/or whip-like tendrils as motors for action, further emphasizing a connection to the aesthetic world of BDSM. So as you can sort of gather, right, I'm thinking about masochism as a fluid concept that gives us a way to diagnose the ways that people are theorizing relations of power and pleasure. In the clip, however, we see that Satterwhite's version of BDSM deliberately confounds readings that would focus on domination, submission, or desire, because his version exists purely on the surface. Most notably, it is not explicitly connected to histories of enslavement or imaginaries of white supremacy or Black submission. The chorus of spinning, dancing men are culled from the internet's archive of online pornography by Satterwhite, but here they do not perform with partners, but merely assemble themselves into a grinding multiplicity. Their isolation from partnered actions removes our ability to read for desire, especially when understood through a matrix of possession and projection, even as it renders them not exactly alone, but part of a larger group. Additionally, Satterwhite has made clear he's not interested in using BDSM's accessories to manifest his own desires, preferring to think of BDSM as an effective landscape. In response to a question about his interest in the practice, he says, "In my real life, I don't like having sex with SM gear. I can do much more grotesque and aggressive play without it. However, I do spend a great deal of time in the context of leather bars and queer clubs." In his focus on BDSM as aesthetic and cultural scene, he attaches it to an urban gay sociality and 1990s minimalist fashion aesthetic. This collapse between the aesthetic of BDSM and a nostalgia for the 90s highlights Satterwhite's interest in a non-normative, which is to say linear temporality, and his creation of a world made coherent by BDSM, but held together with something else. So instead of desire, Healing in My House attaches BDSM to labor, which it presents as a series of furious motions without end. Whips propel motion, and Satterwhite and the men are always on the move, always doing something. I read this as a universalization of labor, which in turn is a commentary on the perpetual demand for labor under late capitalism, when the gig economy and technology have made it easier for people to work constantly without necessarily receiving more remuneration. Importantly, this form of labor does not operate according to a logic of desire. Instead, it circulates according to a logic of necessity, whereby not working is a form of waste, not pleasure. Since all of the figures work, the video and its lush sensuality invites us to consider the conditions that compel such incessant labor and what pleasures may be found within work. Liberation per se is not the goal. And this is kind of why I'm putting it along, against the earlier formulations I talked about. So instead, what becomes important are the pleasures that reside alongside working, which I locate in the movements that performed and the collectivities created in the video. In particular, Satterwhite calls our attention to the excesses produced in and through dance. Dancing allows us to read the collective motions as belonging to work, but also to a party. The grind signaling joyous proximity and forms of intimacy that come with enough knowledge of the other to anticipate motions and to collaborate. Dancing transforms the scene from potential dystopia to euphoria, ecstasy. These are uncontrolled, effective forms that emerge from being and feeling together. That both are visible in the same frame is an important aspect of Satterwhite's work. Satterwhite's own dancing, which he does both alone, both on screen and live, hews closely to the family of voguing, dances that emerged in the 1980s ballroom scenes. At the balls, Black and brown people would move to transform marginalization into fabulosity. But this was more than a party. Imaginative dancing provides a fleshy form of survival. It offers a way toward being something, or a way toward being something other than what was immediately visible, something uncontained by present material conditions. With its fast spins, drops, and angular arm movements, voguing offers a mode of fabulation in which excessive movement anarranges time and narrative. By using the lexicon of BDSM to suture queerness to Blackness in a way that unfurls into pleasures that are distinct from those that we usually relate to BDSM, Satterwhite has given us a way to feel elsewhere. So while I've outlined this relationship to dance and collectivity, these sensations are more deeply unified under the banner of what I call Brown Jouissance, because they are part of an overall mode of relating to the flesh through pleasure and creativity. And I think they're not quite outside, but they are alongside these formations of consent that I've talked about. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I'm so interested in this idea of this sort of choreographing intimacy in this particular way. Next, everyone, we will have Claire Warden, and who will be presenting on the spectrum of consent and practice. Claire Warden is an intimacy director and coordinator, fight director, teacher, and actress, and has worked in theater, TV, and film across America, Europe, and the UK. As a curriculum development coordinator of intimacy director and coordinators, she is part of the community helming the intimacy direction movement across America and the world. Claire has worked as an intimacy coordinator on television and film productions under the studios, including HBO, Hulu, Amazon, Showtime, Sony, and 20th Century Fox. She is part of the team advising SAG-AFTRA and their protocols for nudity and hyperexposed work. Claire made history as the first intimacy director on Broadway with Frankie and Johnny and the Claire de Lune, and also worked as an intimacy director on the Broadway productions of Slave Play, The Inheritance, Jagged Little Pill, Linda Vista, Company, and West Side Story. She was recently awarded Variety Magazine's 2019 and 2010's Broadway Players to Watch, as well as the Special Drama Desk Award for pioneering work as an intimacy choreographer and her leadership in rapidly emerging movement of intimacy direction. Please join me in welcoming Claire Warden.
Hello, thank you. Goodness, Tim, what an introduction. Thank you so much. I'm just going to change my screen so I can see everybody here. There we are. Hi. Wow, Amber, my brain is buzzing and my heart is beating after listening to you talk. Thank you for that. I could take each line of that and spend an hour talking to you about that. So what I'm going to bring to you tonight, I'm going to speak a little bit, Tanise is going to speak a little bit on our experience of working on slave play as intimacy directors. And just to give you a little bit of background, first of all, to introduce myself, I'm Claire. I use she, her pronouns. I'm joining you from the ancestral land of the Lenape and the Canarsie people, now colonially known as Brooklyn, and I acknowledge their rightful stewardship of this land and my tenancy on it. And so I'm just gonna share a little bit about the process of working on slave play. I was with the play from its first performance in Yale, then to the off-Broadway run and the Broadway run. So I've kind of spent a 2-year span with 3 different productions of it. And just for those of you that don't yet know, as an intimacy director, we're there to advocate and facilitate for consent-centered creation of plays of which have sex, nudity, or hyperexposed work in. So I'm there both as a liaison for the departments, but as an advocate for the actors to make sure that they're maintaining agency of their body and that what they're doing is something that they have the space and management to consent to as part of their role. And as much as we can, navigating and negating the coercion, power dynamics, and many aspects of the entertainment industry that go against consent, or have gone historically against actors' consent. So that's what we do. I'm just going to take a little bit of time to talk about, in a broader sense, the particular considerations of the telling of physical stories of consent, sex, kink, and race, and what we're considering the actor's experience of doing that is. And I see this as kind of divided into 2 parts. First of all is the context, and that's like the actual story that the actors are going to be telling. And the first level of consent is do the actors consent to actually telling that story? And we're talking about story as the whole play. We're also talking about each individual happening in the play. And so what we're considering when we look at acting is that there's multiple layers of consideration about consent when we're telling stories, which kind of add on to the I suppose the social interpersonal conversations of 2 people engaging in some kind of intimate sexual activity together. When we're looking at the entertainment business, we're adding on top of that the pretending to tell that story, but we actually do have 2 people who are physically engaging. So we have this kind of multiplicity of consideration when it comes to consent. So when we're looking especially at a story like slave play, which has enormous emotional and physical and I would say kind of somatic asks of our actors, both in the arena of consent and sex, in the arena of race, and how they intersect. What we're looking at is both the consenting to tell this story. Adding into that, also, we're looking at the consenting of being witnessed telling this story, right? So our audience that join every night, depending on which theatre you're in, from 200 to 800, most complete strangers walking in and watching these actors tell this story. And whilst, everybody, the company and the audience, we all kind of enter that contract of willing suspension of disbelief, right? We all walk in and we all like, yes, I do believe, whatever we're seeing, that you you are that person. I do believe that you are this young boy and then you become this old man, and I'll totally go with it. There's also this kind of knowledge that those people in that audience are watching you, the actor. Like if I'm performing, they're watching Claire, the actor, tell this story as much as they're watching the character Claire is playing go through this story. And so that's a kind of part of that multiplicity of consent consideration. And each of the characters in Slave Play, especially our six couples, the play, if you don't know it, centers around, sorry, our six people are three couples, centers around three couples and their kind of sexual journeys and relationships. They have multiple moments of intense, often shocking stories that they're seen in. And so both the actors have to agree to tell those stories and have to be witnessed as the ones that tell those stories. And as we heard from the actors many times, recognized in the street 3 weeks later. Oh my God, I saw you in Slave Play. I saw you do this thing. And then that moment of, oh, I've seen bits of you that I may never have seen before. I've seen you do things that really disturbed me or really moved me or really made me love you. So that's kind of part of an aspect. I will also say that with what we discovered with a play like Slave Play is that the audience's experience and reactions somehow get bound up with the story, right? It's an ever-evolving kind of meta experience that as they sit and watch the play unfold, and they watch the story that's happening on the McGregor plantation, there also, this other story is being created in the moment of them experiencing and reacting to what they're seeing on stage and how it makes them feel and what they think about the people around them that are watching it and their life. And it's being led, sometimes whether they want it to or not, by these actors that are telling this story. And we learned a lot more about that as the productions kind of progressed. But it starts to feed into the kind of the social context of this story, in that in the moment, that evening, there's a slightly different story told depending who's in the audience. I remember hearing a lot from the company. We had a number of what they called blackout shows, which were shows that were only for BIPOC people to come in the audience and watch, and the experience of performing for that audience very different to performing for what was the typical Broadway audience, which is very white, mostly older. And the reaction and experience to witnessing a story like that was a very different story for the audience and the ensemble together. And the kind of going back, the farther layer of context here, the story is the story of this group of people doing this play right now in our society today. You know, Robert O'Hara, who was our director, talked a lot about, he would say, like, they fucked up and gave us a Broadway house. Like, literally all of us, right up until opening night, and certainly first preview, we all sat there imagining that at some point, someone was going to walk in and go, wait, no, we didn't mean it. No, you can't do this. This is Broadway. No, we shouldn't do this, right? So the story of this group of people doing this play in our world today, from the reactions of the audiences to the reactions across the country of people that had never seen the play and hadn't read the play, and still there was enormous, especially on social media, enormous conversation about the play, damnations of the play and exaltations of the plays. So just in our society, the fact that this play was being done and the story was being told by the group of people that were telling it, all kind of feeds into the context of this is part of the experience and I think the consent considerations of being part of this, of stepping into this world, stepping into this story. So that's it. That's kind of a few layers of the context of consent. And then alongside of that, we have like actual, what do we call it? Like physical consent. So the consenting to the things that these actors' bodies are going to be doing or not be doing on stage. And again, that's part of our job is to help facilitate the conversation and to advocate for their agency in that. And so as we work together, we begin by agreeing what the physical storytelling is, the specifics of the simulated sex acts that we'll be engaging in, the levels of nudity that the actors will or won't be showing on stage, and where each individual actor's consent lies within doing that. And there's an aspect of the consideration of consent of, you know, I want that part of my body seen, I don't want that part of my body seen naked, or I do consent to performing that simulated sex act on stage, or I don't consent to being seen in this particular position, but this position is fine. So there's those kind of specificities. There's also the aspect here, especially again in this play, of the consent level of telling that story with a particular scene partner, right? Because who you might be acting with, like who you're working with, especially in a play that has, any play, but especially slave play that has such intense emotional journeys, has a great effect on the journey, the experience of actually telling that story. And for numerous reasons, you know, whether you as an actor are willing to or consent to performing a particular simulated sex act might have a big consideration on the body or the person that you might be doing that with. When we consider the historical, the accumulative kind of intergenerational dynamics and trauma that has been passed through black and white bodies through hundreds of years, regardless how nice and supportive and accepting your scene partner as a person might be, you can't escape and ignore that those with black bodies can't ignore the effect on their somatic system that a white body may have, just being in the room, let alone in physically engaging with. And that's something that, you know, we spent time talking about and looking at and considering, the creative team, the actors and all together, is that the two kind of levels of consideration and holding around what comes up in the actors' bodies, and how they and we as a support system help them manage that. And this is the kind of language that we're starting to form as a kind of the job of consent, because I don't think it can be like, we can't fully, sometimes it's impossible to fully enthusiastically consent. Like that's absolutely 100% fine. And even if there is something that comes up in one's body, that doesn't necessarily mean, no, I cannot do this in this play. But what we want is that recognizing of what's coming up, those somatic messages that are coming up that might be, it might be ancestral intergenerational trauma, might be your own personal trauma, might be the on-taking of other people's trauma or work. that whilst that comes up, the support systems we create to allow that individual to recognize and manage that to a point where they have enough clarity of decision to decide whether they want to engage in the storytelling of this particular sex act in that moment, right? That we're making space to be like, okay, this whatever that feeling is that comes up, right? Is that about this particular sex act here, or is that, oh, that's about what happened on the subway on the way in? Does that mean that I don't want to? No, it means I do want to move through that and do, engage in my job and my work and my challenging career and my craft. So it's about finding ways to release the clause of the limiting on our creative careers, right? And find support for that. So that's the kind of conversation balance, round thinking that we had when we're looking at the consent. And then the final part of that is also just the aspect of sustainability, which is something that differs in a theater production than a TV production, right? But the idea of, when we look at, fine, I consent to doing that, that is okay for me. Is it okay for me today in this rehearsal room as we work on it? Yes. Will it be okay for me for the rehearsal period? Will it still be okay to do this for 3 months, 8 days, 8 times a week for 3 months? Because it has an accumulative effect. It has a toll. There was a lot of self-care and group care and closure practices that we had with the group. But the idea that the telling of these stories, our psyches, as actors, our psyches don't know the difference between the imaginative story we engage in as an actor and that experience actually happening. Our psyches sometimes don't know, and our bodies go through it, and the somatic experience feels the same. So if we're not able to release that, and if the actors aren't able to kind of, I call it flush it out, then the accumulative exhaustion, emotional drain, trauma can build up. And as you continue through the run, what seemed fine and that was the kind of the easy bit might start to get harder and harder, and the willingness to go in and do this again might drift. So there's also that aspect of consent, not just in the moment, but in a sustainable way over the expansion of a run, knowing that it'll be repeated again and again and again. That's a little kind of consideration of that. I want to hand over now and let you hear more other aspects of the work, but hope that's something to chew on for now.
So thank you so much, Claire. I'm really enamored by this idea of sort of different levels and layers and dimensions of consent, and sort of the labor that goes into that. And I really appreciated your take on thinking about this transmission of affect that happens between both, not only the performers on stage, but also the audiences, and how that sort of can change depending on the audience demographic and nature. That is really generative in sort of my research as well. I'm excited to announce our next speaker, who will be speaking on empathy, curiosity, and wonder. Tenise Johnson, who received an MA from Lehigh University in sociology, an MFA from University of Florida, is a student of life, stunt performer, and certified intimacy coordinator and intimacy director for television, film, and stage. Some credits include HBO's Emmy-winning Succession, Lovecraft Country, Rami, Hulu's Wu-Tang and An American Saga, FX Pose, Run the World, The Hunters on Amazon, West Side Story, directed by Steven Spielberg, and limited series The Underground Railroad, written and directed by Barry Jenkins. Tenise is also honored to have worked on Slave Play at the Golden Theater and at New York Theater Workshop. Teaching and performing for over a decade, Tenise uses a multidisciplinary approach to cultivating self-healing and creative wellness practices. Driven to keep actors safe, but the story dangerous, Tenise's devised theater experience, movement training, and spoken word poetry lends for a natural curiosity and commitment to honoring and dissecting what is on the page in order to develop a captivating movement dialogue of action and reaction. They are also an outspoken advocate for diversity and inclusion, boundaries, collective healing, and consent culture. Please join me in welcoming Tenise Johnson.
Greetings, y'all. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Tenise Davia Johnson. I am a non-binary artist. My pronouns are they and them. I am checking in from Harlem today, and I am here by way of my ancestors. Super excited for this conversation. And I guess the first thing I want to say is it's an honor and a privilege to be in this position. And I've learned so much over this. I want to say our industry's been evolving for the past maybe 3 years. And some of that time was during COVID when we were all at home. So it's been a very short period of time with a lot of opportunity and high expectations. My work in particular, I try to focus on curiosity and wonder. In particular, because when we're dealing with such a sensitive topic of intimacy at work, we really want to avoid getting people into situations where they're feeling shame or guilt and shutting down. Some of the things that help this process is really staying away from a binary thought process of right and wrong. And the idea is it's my job as an intimacy director and an intimacy coordinator to meet people where they are. And in my experience, everyone is somewhere on this spectrum of hurt and healing. And maybe we move depending on our emotional fitness for the day. With this focus on empathy, my goal is to keep creating empathetic ensembles with a focus on anti-racism, restorative justice, emergent strategy, and recovery practices. What does that mean? Basically, we have to keep inviting more of ourselves to the process, making space so that more people are seen and heard in the process. And imbuing ourselves with the ability to engage in hard conversations, to maybe make mistakes, apologize, and keep moving. I believe that humans are built and hardwired for difficult conversations, but sometimes we want to be polite or we don't want to be messy. But if you think about the way you rearrange your house, for instance, I live in New York. There is no way that I can reorganize this place without making a mess first. Taking things down, maybe feeling uncomfortable, and then reassessing and thinking about what do I need and what's necessary in this process. And I think as humans, and especially artists, we care about how people view us. And that can make the work challenging sometimes. I was fortunate enough to be a part of the slave play process. And what I really liked about this play, and Claire spoke to this idea, I read it and I was like, wait, we're allowed to do this? We're not allowed to do this. That's the kind of art that speaks to me. And there were many lines in that play where I saw myself on the page. I was like, wow, you can say that out loud or somebody else thinks that. So it was really exciting to be in the room. And it's interesting as you walk through a process and when we deal with intimacy at work, there are many different reactions and responses. And of course, there's going to be the giggle phase where things feel a little uncomfortable and we're not sure how to move. But this project was exciting to me because we were able to find a way, a responsibility. It was bigger than us. We had the opportunity to engage in simulated acts on stage that could spark conversation, could inspire other couples to start talking about things maybe they were too embarrassed to speak about. And I felt like the whole team really gave over to the process and the opportunity to serve on stage and create an opportunity for newness, especially in an institution that where we think the rules are already defined. I want to transition now and talk a little bit more about intimacy coordinating as an industry. I think it's really exciting, all the change that we've made in the last couple of years. And I think that it's imperative to mark that we are not done. There is some real challenges in the way that the intimacy coordinating field and intimacy direction field is working. And I would say it's similar to the white feminist movement in that it's not inclusive. There is a casual racial violence that includes erasure, harm, and being labeled difficult when you speak to your personal harm. And these have been my personal experiences in the work. So I can't even imagine how others that are training or looking to get involved may feel about the work. Why is it important that we talk about that? If we are just moving and accepting intimacy coordinating as the solution without really investigating the lack of intersectionality, we're basically involved in the expansion of the delusion of white supremacy as we continue to leave others out and behind and out of the conversation. Now, this might be hard for some people to hear and talk about, not me. Why? Because I've experienced harm. In particular, there was a lot of feedback from slave play from Black women saying that there weren't Black women involved in the process. It hurt because I was there. However, I was not a part of the media coverage, and I don't think that my name was associated with the work. Personally, that hurt, but then I think collectively it hurt too, because when we want to explore different ways to connect with each other and different types of intimacy, as Amber was talking about, we really want to see people that look like us associated with the work. I'm a little nervous talking about this in this space, I have to be honest, because my goal here is not to point fingers and blame, but is to genuinely ask for more time, energy, and investment in making sure that this is a safe space for all actors, all directors, all producers, and all crews. And ending on a hopeful note, I think that the things this work requires a vulnerability and a sense of honesty and a charge for change because of the access to power we have and the resources we're given. So quickly productions will be like, oh, you can help us. Yes, that's wonderful. And it's important that as intimacy coordinators in the business, we're asking ourselves, am I the right person for this job? Should I be in this space? Am I othering others even more? How can I facilitate so more people are seen and heard in the work? Super honored to be a part of this panel today, and I look forward to the continued discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I was really intrigued by your, that was great. I was really intrigued by this idea of centering or sort of exposing this idea of positionality and humanity within intimacy direction, and also bringing, to focus this idea of intersectionality that's sort of lost, right? Because, we're in an industry where now intimacy directing is being romanticized as the only thing, without having the deep conversation about how we really move forward and thinking about that sort of system that sort of perpetuates a particular type of white supremacy that we don't think we don't sort of put our hand on. So I appreciate you for exposing and sort of obliterating that sort of romanticized notion of intimacy direction. Moving forward, because I know we're short on time, I am so excited to introduce Dr. Sakatupulu. But before I do that, I want to ask and encourage everyone in the audience to start to build questions. If you have heard anything that sort of resonates with you at this moment in time, jot it down. We'll be opening the chat a little bit. Questions will be directed to me, but you're also going to be welcome to sort of raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask our panelists questions as they come up. So I want to encourage you to take out a pen and start to jot and think about things that maybe you don't have answers to, or things you want more clarity on before we sort of end our session today. Again, our next session will be called, or is entitled, Limit, Consent, and Traumatophilia, the Slave Play in Slave Play, by Dr. Avis Sakatupulu. And she is a Greek and Greek Cypriot psychoanalyst. She completed her psychoanalytic training and now teaches at the NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. She's on the faculty of several psychoanalytic institutes across the country. She writes on queerness, psychosexuality, and consent, and is co-chairing of the October 2021 conference, La Panche and the States, the Sexual and the Cultural. Her published articles have received numerous awards, including the annual Essay Prize from the Journal of American Psychoanalytic Association and the Ralph Rowan Award. Her just completed book project is provisionally entitled Risking Sexuality Beyond Consent, Race, Traumatophilia, and the Draw to Overwhelm. The book puts psychoanalysts and conversation with queer color of critique, and his second part critically engages with Jeremy O. Harris's Slave Play. When she isn't working, she rides her motorcycle, cruising Utopia and hoping for good weather. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sakatupulu.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction. I'm really excited to be here today. I have been preoccupied, if not obsessed, with slave play since I first saw it on New York Theater Workshop. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. And I just want to say that I think it's really good that I'm going after Denise, because what they were saying about the mess and the complexity of all of that is, I think, very important in thinking about consent. So, okay, here we go. Let me start by saying that the fact that I'm a trained psychoanalyst means that both my data set and my skill set come from the clinic. I've been reading cultural theory, and queer of color critique for some time, and that has helped me question a lot that my own field leaves unmarked. For example, psychoanalysis has been really dismal in engaging racial difference. In my forthcoming book, which I'll be drawing on today, I try to give back to these fields that have so nourished and enriched my clinical work by putting insights from psychoanalytic thinking and clinical work in conversation with queer of color critique and performance theory. I hope these ideas will be helpful for non-clinicians, which I suspect is the majority of the audience today. Psychoanalytic theory has always had to dive into art and performance to deepen its thinking, so I hope my comments might serve as a reverse offering. My first viewing of slave play was gifted to me by a theater aficionado. As someone who never reads reviews and savors experience that takes one by surprise, and that already tells you something about my relationship to consent, I had no idea what was coming, and for that I am thankful, because what that surprise, that not knowing in advance enabled was singular. The first time I watched slave play, I felt my whole being called to attention, rousing my senses in a way that no work of art ever has before. From there on out, I became overcome with a new desire to experience the play again and again and again. All I knew was that I wanted more. This description may sound melodramatic, but it's true. I do not just mean to amplify how much I like the play or felt changed by it, though both are also the case. What I want to convey is that what took me over was wild and bizarre. Returning to the play felt absolutely exigent, as if I had been taken over by a strange force. It was akin to a possession. The word possession is meaningful here for two reasons. First of all, because it has ties to Freud's description of compulsive repetitions, which he described as being driven by a demonic force. And it also links to the play's third act, which is titled Exorcism. What exactly is the it to be exorcised, however? Part of my book project has to do with how the traumatic past cannot be exorcised. Instead, I suggest that we need to become less preoccupied with what can be done about trauma and more interested in what people do with their trauma. That is, how trauma is brought into presence, how it is made to reappear. Such reappearances occur in a variety of ways and through various mediums. But theatrical performance and sexuality, for example, the sexual slave play in slave play, I'll refer to it as race play from here on out, are especially likely candidates for such channelings. I call the wish to exorcise and heal trauma traumatophobic, to mark how we are collectively made anxious by the reappearance of trauma. And I call the latter approach, bringing trauma into presence, the reappearance of trauma, traumatophilic, to highlight that we are bizarrely drawn to the side of the traumatic, and to note that those iterative revisitations need not make us anxious, and that they deserve our respect and our attention. For me, slave play felt powerfully liberating, though what I, as a white woman, would feel liberated from and why, I couldn't tell you. I became preoccupied with reading and rereading the script, with thinking and rethinking the dialogue, and attended weekly Sunday salons organized by the play's production. I went enthusiastically, but I was also chagrined to realize that I couldn't not go, that I was helpless to resist, even as other obligations pressed for my time. Suffice it to say that I was fascinated, but also scared by this play and by my reactions to it. In retrospect, I was drawn to it, like somebody who, standing over a cliff, looks down and, feeling an inexplicable pull, steps back. Only I didn't step back. I stepped into the vertigo. For a year and a half, I watched the play again and again and again. I went alone and I went with others. I went at planned times, and I went impulsively, as if seized by a grotesque longing. Becoming so infatuated with a work of art is not an experience I had had before. It was dazzlingly intense. I felt fiercely alive and throbbingly present. And it was also dizzyingly burdensome. I found the demands of my interest confusing and exhausting and at times scary. And this preoccupation, of course, as Claire noted that, and so many people had really intense reactions to this play. It received rave reviews and lacerating critique, including petitions to shut it down. And what I'm pointing to here is the impassioned character of this set of responses. And at the Sunday salons, I met many others who were magnetically drawn to the play and who were also attending performances repetitively. And Twitter also tells me that the Sunday attendees were not alone in these iterations. My dramatic experience with slave play has raised many questions for me as to what my own positionality as a white, queer, immigrant woman who partly grew up in Cyprus in its immediate post-colonial period has to do with how engrossing I found the play and why. When the play's run was ending, I attended the closing performance to bid it farewell, and I left the theater that night bereft. Despite this compulsively iterative and torturous quality of my relationship to slave play, this irresistible press did not impair me. I continued to see patients, teach, supervising my trainees' clinical cases, and publish work. Unsurprisingly, this torrential affair imprints itself on my writing and teaching. But I don't mention this productivity to extol the play's fruitful impact on me, because as you'll see, I'm moving in a very different direction than simply professing the play's utility. I mention it because I was really surprised that my extreme need to experience the play repeatedly did not compromise me. In describing my state of possession earlier, I alluded to the matter of what is the it that performance may seek to exercise. In the play's closing act, and I have to apologize to those who have not seen the play for all the spoilers that come. I have unfortunately I spoil this play every time I teach it to my candidates. Okay, here we go. In the play's closing act, we encounter this thematic of exorcism in Kanisha's and Jim's sexual encounter. A white man racially denigrating and raping a Black woman who wanted it, in the sense that she explicitly asks for it, but anyone who has seen the play knows that one leaves the theater not quite sure if she actually got what she wanted. This takes us to the heart of trauma, gendered, racial, and otherwise. It is all too human and perhaps unavoidable to wish that the traumatic past can be healed, that injuries can be excised, and that repair can restore us to a pre-traumatic state. But as a practicing psychoanalyst, I would say that trauma is never cured, that no one is ever delivered back to an intact pre-traumatic state, no matter how good their access to care or their resources. This is a statement that many of my clinical colleagues would agree with, in theory, but when we sit with patients, it is easy to get caught in the quicksand of imagining that therapy can help repair or undo wounds. Such beliefs also prevail outside the clinic. At best, though, subjects learn to live in trauma's afterlife. And I say this not to argue that political struggles for betterment should be abdicated, or that we should give in to social injustices, but because I'm concerned about the burgeoning neoliberal economies that promise impossible healing, and about the renaissance of individualism that feeds on the alluring fantasy of mastery over one's trauma, and because I'm worried about the seductive promises of contemporary healers who tell us that we can be completely delivered from our pain. The truth is that wounds never fully close. They leave behind marks and scabs that can reopen, and this is part of my point today, and I think what I'm finding slave play very helpful with, that these are wounds that we're also strangely drawn to touch. To touch them, we must first act to reopen them. A revisitation that slave play shows us takes repetition, commitment, and work. Trauma, as Christina Crosby poignantly explored, lives on after great pain. Instead of repair, we ideally live on from trauma on different terms than those on which it was inflicted, with trauma becoming folded into our subjectivity, at times even into our sexuality, in transformed and ideally transforming ways. This is true not only about capital T traumatic events, but also regarding the constitutive trauma of our very being. The fact that we are from the get-go exposed to the intervention of the other sexual unconscious, an effect which can never be extracted from the psyche soma, as the psychoanalyst Jean Laplanche argued. This means that we all start out always traumatized, always already traumatized, even as our inaugurative traumas instantaneously become part of our psychic makeup. There is no intactness in our being to begin with, to which we may be restored. Trauma is a condition of our very ontology. Important lineages of thought, starting with Fanon, running through Spiller's work on flesh, Hartman's thinking on racial subjection, patterns and ideas around social death, Sexton's interventions on Black negativity, and other Afro-pessimist intervention, including Wilderson's, point to how violence has been foundational to the subjectivation of the Black subject in particular. When I argue that constitutive trauma cuts through all humans independently of racialization, I'm not minimizing how African men and women were stolen from their lands to be made into flesh, inscribed outside the category of the human. Nor do I minimize how neo-Jim Crow continues to shape Black subjectivation to this day. But I do want to point out that all sorts of sutures the social order provides to white subjects operate such that white people may not have to confront their own always already traumatic ontological status. This allows white people to proceed with life as if their subjecthood is intact, obscuring the fact that the social privileges of whiteness expeditiously patch over the fissures and gaps that permit white subjects to experience themselves as unbroken and unbreakable. White dominance ensures that compensations are always on hand to support this fiction, an illusion so robustly subtended by white supremacy
think we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Just hold on, everyone. Okay, we seem to have lost Dr. Sakaputulu. So we'll get a few minutes. This may be a great opportunity for folks to start to enter questions into the chat as we sort of move forward in our conversation. Hopefully she comes back and she can finish, because I'm really excited about what what she's talking about. I'm jamming. I'm with it. So hopefully we can hear the rest of that beautiful spiel. 1 second. Okay, I'm getting word she's coming back in, so we should be starting momentarily. Well, I guess in the interest of time, oh, 1 second, actually. Here we go.
Sorry. Okay, all right, let me pick up where I left off. Okay. White dominance ensures that compensations are always on hand to support this fiction, an illusion so robustly subtended by white supremacy that white and Black subjects alike are easily left with the impression that whiteness is ontologically non-traumatic. This has significant implications for what version of the unconscious we afford differently racialized subjects. In slave play, the revisitations of Kanisha's ancestral enslaved past are obvious to her husband Jim, and to the audience, while Jim's constitutive traumas are not. Here's what I mean. Kanisha and Jim start out in the first act under the auspices of a sexual regime of affirmative consent. For 3 days, we learn they have been prepping for a scripted race play sexual scenario. Jim has been asked by Kanisha and has agreed to playing the role of the white plantation overseer who sexually aggresses against his dark-skinned slave. In the first act, we discover that Jim is not just playing along, but is also clearly aroused by this play acting. His racial debasement of Kanisha gives him a hard-on. Jim is also terrified by the desires roused in him, which is why he safe words, ending the race play. Kanisha spends most of the rest of the play expressing her upset about his withdrawal, while Jim boisterously protests having been made to do things against his will, but which his hard-on also tells us were in accord with his desires. On the level of affirmative consent, Kanisha's charge is unacceptable. Jim should not have to do something he doesn't sexually consent to. But we are not in the terrain of safety. We are in the wake of trauma, in the terrain of risk, in the weeds of crafting something new, in the territory of what I have come to call limit consent. Unlike affirmative consent, which is conjugated according to the logics of boundaries, mutual agreements, and which seeks to ensure safety, limit consent is after something else entirely, which is related to the sexual unconscious. It is about what happens when we make ourselves passable to another, when we allow ourselves to be taken into strange territories that do not follow the logics of safety, which psychoanalytically is another way of saying that they don't follow the metric of preserving one's own sense of oneself. Limit consent involves a particular kind of surrender to another and to the sexual otherness of one's own unconscious, And in fact, I wonder if that might be a conversation we might have, Amber, around limit consent and affirmative consent, and whether limit consent may not actually be the condition of possibility for agency, allowing oneself to go into that. Such surrender courts novelty and surprise, and for both parties has ties to the rousing of infantile sexuality, and thus of our normative sadomasochism. So while Jim is well within his rights to say no to the race play that Kanisha wants, and more precisely needs, his unwillingness to be passable to Kanisha, to let himself be carried by his own racialized sadomasochism, also captures how he has been more invested in being a good white partner than to visiting with her the harrowing vaults of their shared ancestral history. So let me be clear. What Jim is being asked to do is not to kindly help Kanisha with her trauma. Antebellum and colonial history is not the history of trauma of Black people or people of color alone. It is the history of the traumatic relationship between white people and or colonizers and Black people and or the colonized. So what is ultimately being asked of Jim is to lower his defenses so that he may come into contact with his own ancestral past. And this is the territory of limit consent, of allowing something to course through oneself that one maybe not be thrilled to encounter. This is the mess that Denise was talking about, rather than resisting or trying to defend against it. It is his own ancestral history that Jim resists when he safe words, a history to which he did not consent, but with the ramifications of which he nevertheless has to live. A history that Kanisha wants him, needs him to be in touch with. Her enslaved elders, she says to him in a memorable monologue in the third act, have been watching over them throughout their relationship. Quote, "They're watching me lay in bed every night with a demon who thinks he's a saint. And the elders don't care that you're a demon. They lay with them too. They just want you to know it and me to know it, so I can lie with grace, so I can lie with their blessing." Kanisha's ask is for Jim to encounter something in himself, to let something be roused and course through him as a way of coming into contact with it. In slave play, the summoning of history is reanimated in the excited erotic body, a body that is always already traumatized through racialization, showing us how sexuality can nest the haunting into the present, helping trauma reappear. We see then how possibilities for the new, for the folding of trauma into the subject, what I call traumatophilia, rather than the conservative effort of trying to excise or sidestep trauma, what I call traumatophobia, arise not through affirmative consent, but through limit consent, when we come up against the unbearable in ourselves. Such risk-taking is a way of soliciting the future. It refuses the all too quick turn to the rubric of identity, welcoming rather than sequestering the disruptions ushered in by the sexual. In slave play, we see one example of how new forms of attention to repetition may be generated by tending to the omnipresence of the perverse and the alien in ourselves. And we also see what can become possible when we do not try to soar above our trauma, but embrace how it obscenely and non-consensually shapes us. When we clutch into traumatic experience, it remains inert, and how trauma that is not put into circulation stalls us, which is another way of saying that trauma needs revisiting. Thank you.
Awesome. Wow. Thank you so much. This idea is sticking with me through this talk was this idea that, you know, trauma is never cured, right? And this sort of falsified conjecture that we can somehow escape our trauma or sort of heal from it in a particular way. And I think you really sort of touched on the seductiveness of this particular entity or phenomenon, especially in our culture now, when we're thinking about mental health, when we're thinking about reaching out to therapists and getting better, and that's the sort of way to go. And we're promised to some extent, right, a falsified promise that the trauma will be expunged, right, or left behind, but we see it sort of creep up in different instances. You also talked about sort of this idea of your personal story of rewatching and this repetition of witnessing that I really found provocative in thinking about going into the nitty-gritty of continuously sort of having your your body and your mind in this particular space so so many times, and what kind of trauma that might have sort of done or undone for you, right? As a white woman watching this particular play, especially when we've seen sort of the proliferation of white women who in the theater were upset and got upset and, even accosted Jeremy himself, right? Overall, I think when we're thinking about this conversation of consent, and each of you talked a lot about consent, I'm really interested in when especially in this last scene that you talk about, where consent and language and body sort of interplay, because Kenesha actually doesn't give verbal consent, right? So this goes into this idea of binary, that we should be hearing a yes or a no from somebody based on consent. And sometimes what happens so I guess my question is, what happens when consent escapes language? What happens when that happens, not only in stage, but in real life, and in the digital space? And that question is open to all of you. And I guess the second part of that question would be, do you find consent useful as a vocabulary? And when are there other vocabularies that may better serve your work, or may better serve the work that is happening at hand? Any of you are free to answer.
I'll just speak very briefly, because you specifically mentioned that the last scene and the lack of language, and the kind of creative journey that we went through between the off-Broadway and the Broadway production, in exactly like physically, because we don't have language, how do we address that? Like literally from how much of a nod, like 3 nods, is that the story we want to tell? 2 nods, like when, where, what is it physically that's telling a story of, like that's creating enough nuance in the story for the audience to, as Avgi said, go away and not be entirely sure what happened, and where did the responsibility lie of giving the answer that it feels like the audience so desperately want? Did she or didn't she? Like, again, that binary, was it or was it not? And what you do when you don't give that answer. Thought on that.
I think it's interesting too, if you talk about consent being the lane for us to work through. In my experience, I've found that sometimes I go to work and I'm like, hi, actors, let me introduce consent and boundaries, and now let's use them in real time. It's kind of too much. And I found that this work probably has to start before we get a script or we get to a rehearsal. We need to start investigating how we feel about things, what we're comfortable with, what our body is telling us. Are we listening to our gut, our intuition? And I guess on the other side of that, I think a lot of times people respond to whether or not their no is accepted. And if we look at the other spectrum of that, I want to ask, how do you respond when someone tells you no? To make sure that we're not just getting in a situation where we're asking for something for someone that we're not willing to give.
Yeah, I know I have a hard time with, I mean, I guess the thrust of my remarks and in general, I feel like consent is useful in the legal framework. I don't know that I put a lot of faith in it in actual. I don't know that it's like the bright line, right? Like, I mean, but I think it's really complicated, because I don't know that there's a way to separate out like how bodies are reacting from people's histories and all, and sort of like all of their different formations. So even sort of saying like, one's body reacted this way, and like, this is what the formation, this feels like a formation of desire. it's always embedded in something. So it's not, it's not quite. I just think it's really complex. So I don't know how to tease that out. I mean, I think I'm drawn, in thinking with Augie, right? And sort of, I think one of the problems in this framework of consent is that we're often focusing on the person as like either the consenter or, like it is something that one person is giving rather than like a relation. And I think that's sort of what's interesting about limit consent, right? Is sort of thinking about what it is to be attentive to another. And sort of like this, I mean, I know that that's not the whole framework of it, but I think, but like the bracketing of it is just sort of the like, how does one produce this setup whereby people can be in tune, right? And I think I would say that that's a bigger question than sort of like, did one consent or not?
I was also thinking about this closing scene, Tim, like where there's this question of did she consent or not? And Kanisha nods. And in the script, it's very clearly noted. And anybody who's paying attention, it's clearly noted in the play as well. But not everybody's paying that kind of attention. So Jeremy O'Harris had to say again and again in the interviews, well, wait a minute, like he didn't quite do it without her wanting to, even though we don't quite know what she wanted and whether what he did maps onto exactly what she wanted. Neither does it ever when we're in relations to another. The other is also an other. The other is not our marionette either. But part of what I think is very complicated is that to kind of like borrow your language, Amber, like that it's about the relationship, that when we are thinking of consent, we are affirmative consent. We are thinking not only with conscious experience, what I know about myself, what I want to experience or don't want to experience, but we're also creating a situation where the unknown cannot happen. Nothing new can happen out of affirmative consent. That's not where the possibilities for the new reside. So it's complicated. Like Claire said, the actors were in a way giving themselves over to their roles. That is not exactly consent, not in the affirmative sense. But it is a consent of sorts, even though things will get roused that one does not expect. So I think that is a very interesting complication.
Absolutely, thank you. I guess my next question is really thinking about the energy and the sort of human qualities that come with kink and BDSM, and thinking not only in the theatrical sense on stage, but no, these are real life situations and events and a real life culture, right, that happens off the stage, and usually, as I said in the beginning, right, in hidden sites of pleasure. That sometimes can sort of reveal itself, depending on the person, to be, a place of judgment and also shame. And so I'm wondering how, in your work, you sort of either see the interplay of these sort of energies and coming together or converging, or especially in the sense of slave play, but also in your own work, how are you seeing these sort of entities arise and be handled with fidelity, especially when we're thinking about sometimes how fragile individuals can be, especially when they're exposing themselves to criticism of sex play, especially when it's racialized. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like in the afterlife of care, right? So this is really also about care too, right? Because after the act is done, those are sometimes when those sort of shameful and judgmental sort of emotions arise. And so as we think about this sort of afterlife of the kink activity or afterlife of this BDSM activity, how does that sort of fit into your work and sort of legitimizing, but also making this sort of play okay for folks, especially those who may be Black, who were participating in race play, such as Kanisha, and those who decided an option to go to the McGregor plantation to actually do this particular type of work?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about, I feel like Zoom doesn't like to give me the, I don't know why. It like, whatever, it doesn't like to give me the square. But one of the things that I've been thinking about is the difficulty people have accepting the unruliness of other people's pleasure, right? So when it comes in a form that feels decipherable, like people have a lot, you know, when people think about race and BDSM, people are like very into Black dominant partners because it feels like, oh, this is like atoning for the past. And this is, you know, like it's sort of like, because it plays into this, you know, it feels like a healing sort of script. But anything that goes away, you know, anything that just sort of like isn't legible in that kind of, I mean, this is going into, you know, a lot of some of what Avi was saying also, but sort of like these, I think it's, and also what Claire was saying about like people walking down the street, right? That's sort of like this, the pressures of legibility and how they, you know, they constrict what pleasures people want to imagine are available for people, I think has also been one of the difficult things. I mean, I don't think that that necessarily restricts what people are actually practicing with their partners per se, like, you know, in their own other spaces. But I do think like the paucity of public discourse as a result of that kind of like, people have no idea what to do with this. That then in turn produces like these spirals of like shame and sort of reduce options for care or reduce all of these other types of things.
I would say that even though it may not limit what people do sexually, I would say, and I will say this from my clinical experience, it does very much inflect the shame that they feel about what they do sexually and what's okay to do and what's not okay to do. And it seems to me that part of I think it's going to be impossible to go into this territory without also having a theorization of sadism that is more nuanced than what we have right now. Right now, the theorization that we have of sadism is very stalled. And even though masochism has enjoyed, partly through Amber's work, a lot of very nuanced attention, sadism does not have a lot of, its conceptual toolkit is very sparse. So we don't have a lot of ways of thinking about sadism as care, as a particular, an odd form of care, the kind of care that Jim is asked to give to Kanisha, which makes him also a member in this, not just a provider or procurer, but a participant.
That really resonates with me in terms of giving ourselves permission to surrender, to be in that type of care. I know particularly in my experience, I've done a couple pieces with Black women, and the work of really distinguishing a person from the character really helps us, because then we can build on a story and we don't have to hear, I've never done that before, which is important, right? If we're crafting the story, but it can get in the way of revealing a truth of a character. And I found a lot of resistance from Black women being in circumstances and wanting to be punished as a form of pleasure and surrender and safety. So it's been really interesting to have those conversations with performers and to do a what if. Imagine this is the only space that this Black woman can take off all the weight, the composure, being working twice as hard, doing everything well to excel. Zora Neale Hurston describes a Black woman as being the mule of the universe, right? So where is the space where the woman can receive something else and step into another world? And I'm really thankful for the art that allows us the opportunity to tell these stories, because I find that afterwards the performers are really empowered and they're like, I didn't think about it that way. So I'm really interested in what Avi was talking about in terms of highlighting the needs for being submissive and the benefits of that, and that it's not binary good or bad, but that we all have the opportunity to kind of experience the spectrum of life on all sides when appropriate, and dealing with consent with our partners, of course.
Absolutely. I know we have past time, and so I want to make sure that everyone can get their time going on with their nights or their days, wherever you are in the world. But this has been such an amazing opportunity to sit here again with these artists, scholars who are doing really, really important work. I hope that we can continue this conversation moving forward, hopefully next year in person, because there seems to be a lot of really, really generative, interesting and risky work that's happening that can be really eye-opening to, I think, the way that we move forward, not only in the American theater, but the way that we start to see kink and consent in our real everyday lives. So thank you so much. Please give me please allow and join with me in giving a warm congratulations to our panelists for their time and energy today. This has been a great event, and thank you again from Anna and Kari for curating this event for us at Stanford University. Thank you all so much, and please enjoy your night or wherever you are. Again, I'm Tim Jones, and it was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.